Antonio. Mac Brown, he's going to do it again for Jordan Thomas. Jump ball, Thomas rumbling to the sideline, to the end zone. What just happened? 84 yards.
After 10 great weeks of football, we are finally here with the XFL Playoffs starting this weekend as they play for a chance for the XFL Championship game on May 13th. In this video today, we'll break down the two teams that made it in this week as well as the two number 1 seeds and predict what will happen within these next 2 weeks. So if you're new here and enjoy this type of content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more future XFL content. So let's talk about it. During Week 10 on Sunday, Arlington didn't need much to make it into the playoffs after already being 1 game ahead of San Antonio and the Brahmas already losing to DC on Saturday. So for their game against the Houston Roughnecks, we essentially had a preview a week before their playoff matchup, and it was not as good as I was expecting, to be honest, especially with how Luis Perez has been performing for the Renegades as the quarterback. The D of Houston was able to hold the Arlington offense to a measly 3 field goals, as well as picking off Perez in the second half. Picked off by linebacker Tavante Beckett for 45 yards, getting a defensive touchdown in back-to-back weeks. Houston did not start Brandon Silvers, for which they did not need to, because not only do they have backup quarterback Cole McDonald, but they also have the rushing attack continuing to run their offense for a second straight week, as the running back for this week, Jeremy Cox, had 120 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. With Houston's defense playing really well and not needing to start quarterback Brandon Silvers due to the rushing attack, Houston was able to dominate Arlington in Week 10, despite the Renegades still making the playoffs regardless. For next week, Luis Perez and Devion Smith will probably have to have their best game as an offense, as they need to finish their drives and score touchdowns instead of field goals, especially if they expect to win the whole thing. Seattle, on the other hand, had to have a couple implications that needed to happen before they could clinch a playoff berth. It started on Saturday when Seattle needed St. Louis to lose their game against Orlando, but St. Louis would absolutely stomp a mud hole wide. To the Guardians, and the Battlehawks would win 53-28, with AJ McCarron throwing 6 touchdowns with that W. So in order to make the playoffs, the Sea Dragons would need a big enough win points-wise against the Vegas Vipers to break the potential tie that would happen with Seattle and St. Louis. Ben DiNucci and the Seattle offense would have a slow start until Ben would end up running the ball in for the score, splitting the D and taking the ball himself. DiNucci would have himself a great game overall, having 3 passing touchdowns and 339 passing yards, throwing some bombs to his receivers for the score while dancing on the D in the process. The defense of Seattle also helped in a big way against the Vipers by not allowing any room for Jalen McClendon to score and the offense to operate properly, as Vegas would punt the ball 9 times, as well as picking off McClendon twice, as he'd struggled big time at passing the ball. And that would be huge for the Seattle Sea Dragons, as they needed that point differential to win the game. Despite the 2 picks thrown by Ben DiNucci at the end, the Sea Dragons would win in a huge way, 28-9, clinching the spot for them in the playoffs. Seattle, all in all, have one of the best shots in these playoffs because of how well of an overall team they've become on offense and defense, especially after already beating the XFL South leaders in Houston and almost beating the XFL North leaders, the DC Defenders, if it wasn't for a failed 2-point attempt. Ben DiNucci has been one of the best quarterbacks all season, having an MVP-like season, leading the league with 2,671 passing yards and second with 20 touchdowns, while also leading quarterbacks with 305 rushing yards and 3 scores, despite leading the league in picks with 13. A lot of the credit goes to his receivers, as the Sea Dragons have 3 receivers in the top 10 in receiving yards. So if Seattle can play their cards right and not recklessly turn the ball over like they're known for, Seattle could end up winning the whole damn thing. For the XFL South leaders, the Houston Roughnecks are a very interesting team coming into these playoffs, as they were arguably the best team for the first 4 weeks, as they would dominate the league alongside DC. Brandon Silvers would ball out, being a top quarterback early on in the season, having 10 passing touchdowns in 4 weeks. But after a tragic loss to Seattle in Week 5, Houston would have a rough rest of the season, as they'd lose 2 more to DC and St. Louis, even benching Brandon Silvers for a little while because of how poorly he performed. Houston would pick things up again after they didn't have to play the XFL North Division until later, beating San Antonio and Vegas by the skin of their teeth and then slowly beating down the Arlington Renegades. Despite those 3 losses in a row by Houston, they are still the XFL South leaders, as they've done well for the most part against their South competition. But if Houston has any hopes in trying to win the XFL championship, they'll have to buckle it down and get things together offensively to get back on track and be that team they were at the beginning of the season in order to beat either DC or Seattle. Now, in order for Seattle or Houston for that matter to win the whole thing, they're going to need to go through by far the most balanced team in this entire league in DC. I mean, if you look at almost every position that they have, you're going to find at least a player in that position group who has shown out in one way or another. Starting at the quarterback position, you have 2 guys who have been playing lights out football. As starter, Jordan Ta'amu has been phenomenal, having an MVP-like season, continuing to dominate the XFL for 2 years in a row now, passing for nearly 1,900 passing yards and 14 touchdowns, but also rushing the ball for nearly 300 yards and 2 scores. The rushing attack has been the focal point for this offense, as DC leads the league in rushing stats. That credit mainly goes to the star running back on the team, Abram Smith. Smith has had a monster season his first year coming out of Baylor, as he'd have 778 rushing yards and 7 touchdowns, leading in both categories in 10 weeks. Defensively, the defenders live up to their namesake as they lead the XFL in pick sixes this season, and a lot of that is led by the lockdown secondary safeties Michael Joseph and Santos Ramirez. At the end of the day, DC by far has the best lineup going into these playoffs, as each team has equally the same chance to win it all. So with my final predictions for the XFL playoffs, the XFL South winner between Arlington and Houston on Saturday, I pick Houston to continue their XFL dominance and not allow Luis Perez to have any room for improvement. And then for the XFL North game between the Seattle Sea Dragons and the DC Defenders, I'm going to take DC. Not only because DC has already bested Seattle twice now in some wild games, and even won in DC already, but I think DC is going to methodically not force anything on offense and just run the offense the way they know how, which is by running the ball and, when necessary, hit a quick play action to catch the D off guard. Unless Seattle can also play in the moment and not try to force any bad plays, Seattle might have a good chance to win, because if Ben can throw a lights out game with no turnovers, there's a good bet on a Seattle dub, because Ben hasn't thrown a 0-pick game since his Week 2 game against St. Louis. Now for the XFL Championship between the Defenders and the Roughnecks, both teams have ran through their divisions and both teams have earned the spot that they're at. But like I said before, I really don't believe in Houston, and I don't think Houston, regardless of who they're facing, won't win. They're way too inconsistent against good teams offensively to keep their D off the field. And DC is so fundamentally sound in what they're trying to accomplish, I feel like DC would win in significant fashion and become the second ever XFL champions. Alright, now that we have approached the playoffs and concluded the XFL 2023 regular season, I just want to say thank you to those who have continued watching throughout the weeks. It was great being able to watch football again week by week during a busy NFL offseason, getting to analyze what happened and learning so many cool rule changes. I'm so excited to see what the potential this league can have under some actual management and hopefully some new opportunities. But that'll be another video down the line though. If you enjoyed the video today, make sure to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment down below on who you think is going to win the whole thing and win the XFL championship. And keep an eye out for next week as we get to talk about who's going to be winning the XFL awards, in my opinion. Thanks again for watching and have a good one.